Welcome to the Green Urbanist, podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hello everyone. This episode is a conversation between myself and Dr. Brian O'Keally. Brian is a clinical psychologist working for the National Health Service here in England, and he also happens to be my brother. I sat down with him to discuss how climate anxiety, or climate despair, as it's sometimes called, are actually perfectly healthy responses to the crisis we're facing. And we also talk a bit about how maybe we can manage these feelings through things like taking positive action and also practices that involve acceptance and mindfulness. We also go on to discuss some of the interesting ways that our psychology actually gets in the way of taking action on climate change, things like cognitive dissonance, and keeps us in the status quo. It's a really interesting discussion. Remember to subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you're listening, and also follow the Green Urbanist on social media. I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. But for now, here's my conversation with Brian. Can you tell me about climate anxiety and things like that?
So I guess lots of people now are experiencing increased anxiety about the climate emergency. And I suppose really one of the first things to say about it is that, lots of anxiety you might see clinically is kind of, by its nature, I guess, is somewhat irrational, So for example, like a fear of, let's say, spiders, though there's a kind of a grain of truth in it, people are afraid to an extent that it isn't rational. It's not protecting them anymore because they're afraid of harmless spiders.
Yeah.
Whereas climate anxiety seems to be something quite different, because someone is afraid of something that actually it's almost the opposite. It's actually maybe in some ways being downplayed, the seriousness of it, but they are very anxious about something which is a very real existential threat.
Yeah.
So I guess, we spoke before, didn't we? We said that it's probably not something that would be amenable to, or you would even want to treat, because it's it's anxiety about something. It's genuine.
It's quite natural to feel anxious about it.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, and I think really probably underneath the anxiety is probably a sense of grief or loss.
Yeah.
This kind of sense.
I've heard people say that, yeah.
Yeah, this kind of feeling of almost, I remember reading an interview in the paper, one of the Extinction Rebellion protesters who was in, who had been arrested and was in a police station in London, and they just spoke about this kind of deep sense of grief and loss they felt in the kind of hours they had in the police cell, and I think that's probably what's underneath this kind of word of anxiety. It's maybe more a deeper sense of losing something kind of fundamental and irreplaceable.
I've heard people call it climate despair as well, which maybe is a more fitting term, because it's almost like that lack of hope.
Yes. Yeah. And so I guess psychologically, I guess anxiety comes from something you often draw with patients if you're doing a piece of therapy on anxiety, is that most anxiety comes down to the perceived awfulness of the situation divided by your ability or your perceived ability to cope with it. And I guess for most people who have anxiety clinically, their perceived awfulness of the situation is more than the reality of the situation. I think if someone says, if I fail this exam, my life is over, but the perceived awfulness is more than the reality. And their ability to cope is underestimated. But I guess, again, this is the reason why it's not similar to clinical anxiety, is that the awfulness is often underestimated, and our ability to cope is probably, overestimated, how quickly we feel that we could actually right this situation, or how easily we could cope with, when you people, I guess, say 1 degree or 2 degrees, but obviously that's not the reality. That's not how it would actually manifest. So it's very different from the anxiety you might see in a clinical setting.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said before that I in the past had to was dealing with social anxiety in going into new social situations. I'd often be very anxious about it, and the way I got over that for the most part is just by doing it a lot of times. And so just from exposure, I guess my body sort of realized after a while that actually the situations are never as bad as I imagine them. you can't do that with fears around climate change. So like, how do you, and as you said, you wouldn't necessarily want people to stop feeling anxious about it, but how do you manage it in a way that isn't overwhelming?
Yeah. Well, so we sometimes talk about, things that are within your kind of sphere of control, or at least your sphere of influence, because I guess maybe, the part where it could become maladaptive, kind of climate anxiety or climate despair, is, where it's stopping you from doing other things in your life. So you could imagine it kind of manifesting as a kind of a devaluing of everything else in life, because what's the point in doing X, Y, or Z? Because essentially it, in some ways it feels like the world really is ending in lots of ways, and of course other things in your life might really get kind of deprioritized if that's your frame of reference. So if I were working with someone and that was their main kind of complaint, I'd be encouraging to look at the things that are within their circle of influence or their circle of control. So what are the things they can do? That might just be, the things that we're all encouraged to do. Things like recycling and all of that stuff. But it might be beyond that. It might be like activism, trying to kind of influence policy, trying to kind of advocate, whatever the person, whatever is kind of within they feel is within their sphere of control or influence.
Fair enough. Yeah.
But equally, I think that would probably help the person to feel more activated. But again, I'd go back to the fact that I wouldn't expect to get rid of the anxiety, because the anxiety is there for a genuine reason. Like I always say to patients when we're starting a piece of work on anxiety, I always say to them that the main rule of exposure-based therapies, which are the main therapies for anxiety, as you described, for like social anxiety, putting yourself in the situation again and again until you realise it's not dangerous. But I always say to them, but let's say we put you into a room with a tiger, and the tiger was genuinely dangerous. You'd never stop being afraid, because you're never learning it's not dangerous, because it is dangerous. So if the danger is real, you don't stop being afraid.
Right.
So I would.
That's just an evolutionary. That's how you keep yourself alive, by being afraid of things that are actually dangerous.
Well, yes, exactly right. And I often tell people about those famous, very sad experiments where they removed the amygdala, which is kind of the fear center of the brain in monkeys. And the monkeys wouldn't live very long in the wild, because they do all sorts of daft things like picking up snakes and getting into fights with much bigger monkeys, because they just don't have any fear.
Wow.
So fear keeps us alive, So, but yeah, I guess the take-home message is that I would say that climate anxiety is kind of, maybe it feels similar to like anxiety. You might have like an anxiety disorder that you might see clinically, but actually kind of phenomenologically it's very different, because it's not... it's not driven by kind of a misappraisal of threat. It's driven by a very real appraisal of threat.
I think this could be quite nice for people who are listening to realise that they're not alone, and that they're not being silly, or they're not overreacting. As you said, it's actually a very justified reaction to have to the situation we're facing, and you just need to find ways to make yourself feel like you're, I don't know, contributing to being part of the solution rather than being part of the problem. And I also think just putting your own action in perspective is that we're only one person. You're only one person. Like, unless you're the president of a country, probably your sphere of influence is pretty small. And you shouldn't feel depressed about that. Just, accept that it's not up to you to save the world, and I think that can help you to just kind of shed a lot of that feeling of burden, maybe.
And I mean, I think, there is a therapy that's sometimes used for people who are struggling with anxiety, which is called acceptance and commitment therapy. And acceptance and commitment therapy is basically, as it says in the title, it's about kind of fully accepting life circumstances. That doesn't mean being resigned to them. It just means looking at them and not pretending that they're not there.
Right.
So accepting the climate crisis would be looking at it fully and unflinchingly and saying, like, this is how bad things are. So acceptance is always a difficult word clinically, because people sometimes kind of think it means giving up.
Right.
But acceptance just means looking at something unblinkingly and seeing it for what it is, not pretending it's something it isn't. So it's accepting life as it is in this moment, and then committing to do whatever is within your sphere of influence to change, this circumstance. So you're committing to live a life that's in line with your values. And if your values are about kind of, saving the planet, then, you would kind of commit to doing whatever is within your ability to do to influence that. And so that, I think, for someone who's struggling with anxiety around the climate emergency, that's what I would encourage them to do, to fully accept and look at this problem we've got and to commit to doing whatever is within their ability to do. And to do that again and again and again in small ways and big ways.
It seems like a lot of what you learn from mindfulness. It's kind of like what Buddhism and meditation is about, isn't it? It's like, just accept things. How are you feeling right now? What's your breathing like? What's going through your mind? Just accept it the way it is.
Yes, and you're right. ACT has at the centre of it mindfulness practices, because a lot of mindfulness is accepting reality for what it is rather than what we prefer it to be.
I got into a really good routine of doing meditation in the mornings, and then we had a lot of roadworks on my street for about 2 months, and so all morning it was just drilling, and I couldn't meditate, so I gave up, and I could never, and I've totally lost it now. I need to get back into it, because now I have no excuse. So roadworks have stopped. But I lost the habit.
Well, so it's funny you mentioned meditation, because I think I'm currently in the middle of my longest run, which is I think I'm on about 30 days. And I don't think I've ever actually managed 30 days in a row unbroken.
Yeah, it's tough.
But you know what allowed me to do it is a piece of advice. I went on a training day, and a piece of advice they gave was, set yourself the target of doing it for 1 minute every day.
Right.
You're not trying to trick yourself into doing it more. So you're not trying to say, do it for a minute, but really, you're going to do it for 10. Just do it for 1. If you want to do it for more, you can do it for more.
Yeah.
But there's no goal of increasing it beyond a minute.
Okay.
If you want to do it for an hour, you can. But a minute is the goal. And that's what I found. And some days I do 20 minutes, some days I do 1 minute.
Right.
But I found that really helpful.
Yeah. I often find if I do my 10 minutes meditation, I stay sitting for a while longer, because I'm like, I'm enjoying this. I want to stay here. When you sort of build up the initial skill, when you're not just fighting against it, and you can actually get into it like with relative ease, it's such a nice feeling, and you actually want to do it every day.
Yes, and I think as well there's something about, I guess that advice, do it for a minute, is based on that idea that the hardest part is sitting down, doing it. Once you've done that, you've kind of done the majority of it.
Last time we talked, you mentioned something called terror management theory.
Yes.
And then we got interrupted and we didn't finish it. And I'm dying to know what it is, because it has a very cool name. It sounds very intriguing.
Yes. Yes, you're right. Well, basically, one of the most fundamental ideas really in psychology is that, we tend to avoid thinking about things that we find uncomfortable. And it has different names, in like psychodynamic theory, it's kind of denial. But, kind of in social psychology, they call it terror management, or the terror management perspective. The way I came across it was someone, when I was doing my undergraduate, someone did a really interesting research project, which just has stuck in my head, and my partner is also a psychologist, always makes fun because I reference it all the time. It's just lodged in my head as like such a kind of it just tells me why we do research, because so many things in psychology actually don't follow the logical path that you think they would. Yeah. And it's only when you actually think about why that is that I think that's the role of psychology sometimes, is explaining the things that don't seem to make sense, rather than just applying like a framework around stuff that we all kind of know anyway. But anyway, this research project looked at average driving speeds, which I think they found a way to independently monitor. So it wasn't, I think it was done on something they attached to people's cars.
Right.
It wasn't self-report, which in psychology is notoriously kind of inaccurate.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure everyone thinks they drive slower than they actually do.
Anyone who's told their GP how many units of alcohol they drink.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Is aware of how inaccurate self-report is. But anyway, so they showed these participants either those really violent road crash adverts that used to be on TV in Ireland, the really horrific ones, or they showed them like a neutral clip
with Fleetwood Mac playing in the background.
Yeah,
the really sad Fleetwood Mac.
Man of the World, wasn't it?
Yes.
So yeah, that's all. No. But so they showed them one of those clips, and they showed the other people a neutral clip, and then they monitored. I think they monitored their speeds coming to the experiment and leaving, basically. And on average, anyway, they found the people who saw the violent clip drove quicker than the people who
wow.
saw the neutral clip. And that's the total opposite of what you'd expect.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, people who see the horrific clip will be like really scared and will want to drive more carefully, but they found the opposite. And the way they explained this was through something called the terror management perspective, which is basically, really kind of really basic, well-validated finding in social psychology, is that we all tend to think that we are, for want of a better word, special or unique or different from other people. So basically, if you ask people something like, how good looking are you? Most people will say they're better looking than average.
Yeah, sure.
How intelligent are you? Better looking than average. How successful are you going to be in future? More than most people.
Yeah.
But obviously that's impossible, that everyone is better looking and smarter and more successful than most people.
Yeah.
So we tend to inflate our view of ourselves. And the way that plays out in the terror management perspective is that sometimes we tend to do things to confirm our sense of superiority. And so the theory went that the people who saw the violent clip, and this is not a conscious process, this is something that goes on below the level of conscious awareness, but it kind of scares people to think that could be them. So they sometimes will do things to prove that that's not me. I can drive like that and I don't get into accidents.
Yeah.
It proves that sense of superiority. I'm a better driver than most. I can drive quickly and not get into a horrendous crash.
Right.
And so basically what that tells us is that we all do things to manage upsetting or distressing information. And sometimes those things are kind of counterproductive. I don't have any, this is just kind of following the theory out. I don't have any kind of, I don't think there is any research around this bit, but I would imagine that because of the high level of fear and anxiety that people feel when they're exposed to the climate crisis, that they just find ways to either blank it out or to actually do the opposite as some kind of unconscious way of proving, no, that isn't me. That isn't the reality. That isn't going to happen. And I think that's a danger of trying to use shock or emotive tactics to elicit behaviour change. People don't tend to actually respond to shock, I think, in the way you expect them to. They tend to actually just respond in a more self-protective or defensive manner.
That's
really interesting research to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Should try and get some funding for that.
No, definitely. And, again, really kind of a fundamental finding in social psychology is cognitive dissonance. So, when something goes against when two beliefs conflict, it kind of causes dissonance. The classic example is like smokers. Every smoker says, I can quit whenever I want to, because basically the fact that they smoke usually conflicts with their self-concept of them being like an independent person who's in control of their destiny, let's say. Yeah. So usually being addicted is not part of people's personalities. That's why everyone says, I can quit whenever I want to. But then why don't you?
Exactly.
And people come up with all the reasons why they don't. Just because I really enjoy smoking, because of this. There might be some truth in those things, but what they're doing there is you can either change what you're doing, or you can subtly shift your beliefs so that these two things don't conflict anymore.
Which is much easier than changing behavior.
It's much easier. So people do this all the time, and they're not aware of it. But where they experience that kind of slight mental tension and discomfort that's called cognitive dissonance, they'll normally subtly shift one of their beliefs, so that there's no longer that dissonance.
Wow.
And I think again, this is something really interesting to look at, and there's enough research in this area, but I'm imagining that this kind of belief that essentially, we're seeing the beginnings of the world ending in lots of ways, that's a very dissonant cognition to, everything is fine, I'm a special person, my life will always be fine, etc. All of these beliefs, which are actually really protective. To actually, I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent now. You can edit this out. Okay. But there is something called depressed realism, where depressed people are actually sometimes better judges of how attractive they are, how successful they are, and all the rest of it, than someone who isn't depressed. So this kind of, these kind of, I wish I could remember the term in social psychology, but these kind of self-inflating thoughts are actually really healthy. We all have them. They kind of buffer us against, trials and tribulations of life, I guess. So, if anyone listening to this is like, oh my God, maybe I'm not as great as I thought I was, it's fine. Nobody's as great as they think they are, but thinking you are is really healthy. So, just forget you heard this information, let it sink in.
Yeah. Well, that's like just having self-esteem, isn't it? It's
It
like
is,
you have
it
to
is,
believe
it is.
that you're a good person, that you're smart. You know, like that
Exactly.
gets you up in the morning and
Exactly.
keeps you going.
Nothing wrong with that. So that's fine. Just go on kind of believing those things. They're psychologically healthy to believe within reason, as long as it's not kind of grandiose, because then you start to annoy other people. But anyway, so I can imagine how this would play out in terms of climate emergency, the climate crisis, is that we have to somehow shift our beliefs.
Yeah.
And we can either do that by denying the reality of the situation we're in, which lots of politicians are doing. So you just kind of deny it, and then suddenly there's no dissonance. So if actually it's not as big a problem as we think, then net zero by 2050, and probably sometime after that, because I don't think we're even on track for that. But that's not dissonant anymore if the situation is not as bad as we think it is. But if you accept the situation is as bad as you think, how can you kind of go on, eating beef, driving a diesel car, taking long haul flights, buying your clothes in, like fast fashion.
Yeah.
All of these things that make life easier. And, Ross will know I drove us here, so I drive. So, that's...
We're in the middle of the countryside. There's no public transport. So
I drove, yeah, that's true. So that dissonance is there for all of us. And I guess we just have to think about what beliefs we're twisting and morphing and realigning so that dissonance goes away. And the problem with dissonance is it stops you doing things that would actually change a very real situation. Think of the smoker who won't quit smoking. Their dissonance allows them to keep doing that. The ways they're resolving their dissonance is allowing them to keep doing that. And so the ways we resolve cognitive dissonance is often something that kind of stops us from solving problematic situations.
Yeah, and I think this pops up a lot when people want to take a personal approach to their carbon emissions. We'll say now, like as a caveat, I would say that don't worry about your personal carbon emissions. It's nothing compared to industry and all the huge energy use that goes into producing food, producing everything, all construction. All this stuff is way bigger than you driving to the shop or cycling to the it's very, very difficult to basically the message isn't that you need to change your behavior.
No.
The message is the system has to change to allow you to live a more sustainable life.
It's what George Monbiot calls micro-consumerist bollocks.
Yes, exactly.
If you just stop using plastic cotton earbuds, then we'll be fine.
Yes.
Yeah, so just stop doing that and it'll be fine.
And I have stopped using plastic earbuds, and and I'm happy about that.
Yeah,
I'm glad I don't do it anymore.
But it's nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed. Yeah, but what I was getting at with that is that often you talk to people who are wanted to do something positive, and they find something that they sort of cling on to, and they're like right, I'm gonna do Meatless Monday, or I'm gonna they'll find something, they'll be like, that's within my realm of believability that I can change my life to do this thing that's quite small, and you're like, but how many short haul flights do you take every year to go on holidays? That's 100 times more than just this other thing that you're thinking about. And it's because, if you really look really objectively at your life, you might not like what you see, and that's really difficult to deal with.
And I guess all those things are ways of resolving dissonance. So the way I live my life, because the way everyone lives their life contributes in some way to climate breakdown. I don't like that idea, and most people don't. And so if I do certain things, in my case, I don't do meat, and I recycle kind of obsessively. I literally carry a paperclip home and recycle it if I have it when I'm out and about. But I think that says more about me than anything else. And all of that stuff helps you feel better, because it feels it feels a bit like, okay, this is making the situation better. But as you say, it's bigger stuff that's needed to make it better.
But also, I suppose as a something, I think there's two levels you can think about these problems. There's the global level where you say, well, it doesn't matter if I recycle or not. Like there's so many bigger factors at play. But then at the local level, the difference between you properly recycling your washing machine or just driving out to the countryside and throwing it in a field, that has a really big local influence. And so every time people are able to make better decisions, that's better for their local environment in terms of pollution. And,
Yes.
you know, like car traffic is the big one in cities. Cities are the air quality is so poor because people either, you know, want to drive or they don't have the option not to drive. And so we're in the situation now where everyone's individual actions creates a huge local problem.
Yeah.
And that's where so that there's two different levels, I suppose, to think about it.
Yeah, and that makes sense because I guess it's a bit like the kind of psychology of voting where, you know, people don't vote because they say, oh, my vote doesn't make any difference.
Yeah.
And you know, I guess the problem with that reasoning is that there's kind of this slight contradiction at the heart of it because it's like at an individual level, you're kind of right. But if everyone thinks that and acts accordingly, then it's a problem. So I guess it's similar with like all the things we do every day. Probably it won't make a difference if you drive to the shop that one time or not. It won't make a difference if you order the steak that one time or not. But it's just that everyone doing it and you doing it many, many times is what makes the difference. So yeah, it's an interesting kind of. I suppose it's slightly paradoxical, isn't it? It's like it doesn't. You're right unless everyone thinks that, and then we're not all right because if we all do it, then it does make a difference.
Yeah. I wonder about like people who work for fossil fuel companies, how much cognitive dissonance they have to endure on a day-to-day basis, because they've known actually for decades. They were one of the first people, their in-house scientists, who knew about climate change.
Yeah.
And buried it, you know, and like hid it up. So, you know, they're all aware of it, but they must have to tell themselves like, oh, well, we're just not ready to end fossil fuel use, or, oh, the media is just blowing it out of proportion, or, oh, I'm helping people because their energy is cheaper, they're living better lives. If we stopped, then energy would get too expensive. And, you know, they must have to tell themselves all these things.
Yeah, we're
keep
doing
going.
everything we can to offset it in some way. But really, are they? But, you know, but yeah, you're right. Loads of probably ways of managing that uncomfortable dissonance of this is not how I view myself. This is not kind of, you know, but equally, you know, I need my job and and this pays me well. And yeah, so yeah, lots of opportunities for lots of dissonance and lots of creative ways of coping with that dissonance and realigning your thoughts. It's really interesting. I think dissonance is a really interesting. It's something we all kind of need to consider, really, in what things make me uncomfortable, what things jar with my self-concept, and how do I make those uncomfortable feelings kind of go away.
How do you figure it out, though? It's a lot of self-exploration, isn't it?
It is. I guess maybe it's just a case of noticing the dissonance as it happens, you know. I guess like most things, it's hard initially, it becomes a bit easier the more you do it. But I guess, you know, full disclosure, you know, as a psychologist, it's not something I, you know, sit around doing all day. It's maybe I'm more aware of it than most people, maybe not. But I guess if it is something someone was interested in doing, you know, and they felt like, you know, they were holding themselves back because they weren't, whatever the situation in their life, they're not viewing it, you know, they're not viewing it realistically or accepting it in its kind of full form. So I'm thinking of like, I don't know, the really obvious example is the smoker who always says, you know, I quit any time or whatever it is. Those big things in your life, becoming aware of them and the ways that you're twisting your thoughts to be kind of slightly more palatable. Those are the things that we should be aware of. Because I guess another thing to say as well is that, you know, we have all of these, the field of psychology that deals with kind of reasoning and thinking is cognitive psychology. And I guess in cognitive psychology, you know, one of the main messages is that, well, our minds all take shortcuts outside of our awareness because there's just too much information to process in that kind of slow, laborious, kind of, you know, cognitively heavy way. We all have to take shortcuts. And those shortcuts are called heuristics. I think it's Daniel Kahneman who won the Nobel Prize.
Thinking fast and slow.
So it's those kind of different processes. You know, the kind of thinking fast is often the automatic, heuristic-driven thinking. And we all do it. You know, it's kind of a quick and dirty way of thinking. But you know, if you find it's getting you into trouble, then you might want to try to engage the slower thinking processes where you weigh things up in a kind of a reason-driven way rather than a quick heuristic-driven way, which is use quick kind of rules to sort things, you know.
Ah, okay. Is that sort of like acting on instinct in a way?
Yeah, it's basically acting on kind of underlying schemas, I guess, which is kind of like these cumulative beliefs that we all kind of build up over time. So, like, I suppose if I give you an example, let's say like heuristics, those mental shortcuts might allow you to, let's see, what something they allow you to do with kind of relative ease. I guess like for me, every time I go into a supermarket, because I don't eat meat, I just kind of screen out all the meat options. Yeah. And sometimes you hold something up and you're like, is this plant-based or is this? I can't tell. So you have to go into that slow thinking. Yeah. But most of the time I just filter out loads of things in the supermarket, and just, I'm not really aware I'm doing that. I'm not looking and saying, that's chicken, that's beef, that's chicken. It just kind of, is almost filtered out for me. So heuristics kind of just allow us to do things quickly, because otherwise I'd have to look at everything and be like, do I eat this? No, I don't eat that. Do I eat this? No. So yeah. And if I go into the same supermarket all the time, I literally know like there's whole bits that I'm mentally screening out because I know what's there. Whereas heuristics get us into trouble as well, because heuristics are the things that say keep racist or prejudicial beliefs going. Because we develop a kind of a mental rule, which is like, let's say, I don't know, because I'm Irish, I can use this example. Let's say if you think all Irish people are drunks, heuristically, you will just you'll just notice times that you see drunken Irish people. If you kind of see times, if you meet an Irish person who doesn't drink, you'll just kind of filter that out and say, oh, that's just kind of a one-off. That's so heuristics kind of, they're a quick and dirty form of thinking. They just kind of we just kind of do stuff really quickly, and it kind of is an efficient way of thinking. But yeah, it also gets us into trouble because we kind of don't give things all the reasoning that they necessarily that we should for certain things.
I think that's actually a huge part of the problem with like business as usual, which is like, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like that sort of lethargy of changing. Where you're everyone's sort of like saying like, we have to be doing things differently, and then day to day everything just sort of stays the same. Because it's very hard, because so much of everything we do in life is that kind of heuristics, like if this happens then I do this, whereas actually you have to constantly step in and say, oh no, now I have to do something else, or I have to change the way I do this, that I've always done it this way.
Yes, no, exactly. And I think that makes me think of a really interesting interview I heard on Radio 4, where they were talking to someone who, it was from like, they were kind of someone who works in education, and they were saying, but they're talking about some study basically where, so the radio show was about education kind of during and post-COVID. And basically this person they were interviewing used the example of, in London, every time there's a tube strike, London as a whole in the weeks afterwards becomes more efficient in terms of the movement of people around London, because people had to find ways of doing the same journey in a different way, and they often discover ways of doing it quicker. So like, actually, if I kind of do this bit, if I go down this road, or whatever it is, I get there quicker. So they find for a period of time afterwards, actually everything moves more efficiently, even when the tubes start up again, because people have kind of had to rethink how they do things, and they find a way to do it slightly more efficiently. And they were talking about that, in terms of education. They're like, now we've had to do things totally differently. But actually, when we go back to the norm, hopefully it'll be a more streamlined norm, where we kind of take some of the things we've had to rethink and do differently. And I think that, what we need is something to really shake us up. And maybe COVID will do that, where we suddenly have to do things differently. And we hold on to some of that different way of doing stuff. I really hope that is what happens. I
really hope so as well. And I think we've seen some of it in cities around how quickly cities deployed cycle lanes in large pavements.
Yes.
Where there was probably campaigners in cities like campaigning for that for years, and it never happened. And once the sort of business as usual, the sort of normalcy shifted, suddenly it became like, we can just do this and let's just do it. As you said, I really hope that energy stays with us, and we can, because even after all of us have been in lockdown and so many potentially positive things have happened, what was it? Global greenhouse gas emissions only reduced by like 6% or something.
I know that.
Like not even in line with how quickly we have to do year-on-year reductions to meet the Paris Agreement. So, I mean, we have to do a lot more. Like our lives will have to change a lot more even than they have in the past year, which is a scary thought.
So yes, no wonder your mind wants to protect you from that thought.
Yeah.
The problem is, you know, your mind will, for a lot of people, will protect you right until the point of no return. So, so it's definitely a point at which hopefully we can shake up our kind of all the mental shortcuts we've been taking and think about things more effortfully, but maybe more creatively.
Do you have an idea in your mind about what it would look like, let's say like 2050, 30 years time? Imagine if we achieved all the targets and we managed to like curb global warming. Do you have an image in your mind of what like your life could look like and how things would be different?
I was thinking about this earlier today, not exactly that question, but like what, because I just listen to so much radio because I spend a lot of time in my car, which is really, really hypocritical of me, but I have a job in the community where I see people in their homes, so I unfortunately have to do it. But anyway, it's me resolving my dissonance. So I listen to lots of radio programs, and there's a radio program where they're talking about loads of people moving out to the countryside, obviously, which has happened a lot in COVID because people can now work remotely. But it got me thinking about how actually one of the ways that we could get to net zero quicker would be universal basic income.
Yeah.
So basically, if people were freed up to be at home more, to spend more time with their families, to kind of invest in, in a life that doesn't involve constant commuting. I think that would be one of the things that I would imagine the world would look like, but that there would actually be a movement away from everyone having to, well, not everyone, but a huge chunk of the population having to do a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday.
Yeah.
So I'd imagine lots more kind of working from home. I think, universal basic income would be part of it. But I do think that a big part of it as well would be a return to life that we might see as being kind of like a life of a bygone time. Life where we actually do things that don't involve, large amounts of energy to do. I think to achieve that goal, I think life would have to be really stripped back. And doing things, that don't involve that aren't energy intensive anymore. Because I think it's basically that, or, the line during Brexit was, we'll figure things out using technologies that don't exist. That seems like the most massive cop-out ever.
Yes.
Saying we'll do it in ways we can't foresee now, which is just like, that, I'd love to have that much faith that we would figure it out down the line, but I don't know that we will. So I imagine life will look like a kind of a more stripped back version of life as we know it now.
Yeah, and I don't think that's a negative thing, because I think about like working, I have, I'm lucky that I'm very passionate about what I do, and I also voluntarily do extra work to produce this podcast and other things. But I do think about like the things that I wish I had more time for are things that are actually very cheap or free and not very energy intensive or material intensive, like reading, meditating, sleeping. I don't think anyone gets enough sleep, to be honest. Playing music, like spending time with friends, socializing, eating food with people. And it's like, but we sort of are put into the system where we have to spend all the time we should be doing that. We're actually driving around or commuting and going to offices which we don't really want to be in, which have, fluorescent lights on 24/7. And there's just like all this, it's sort of like, it's one of the messages I always try to push in the podcast is the idea that climate action can also mean an improvement to our quality of life and our health and well-being.
Yes. Yeah.
And that for many years, and probably pushed forward by fossil fuel companies, there was an idea that it was a sacrifice. You have to give up things. You have to stop eating meat, even if you like eating meat. You have to stop driving your car, And it's like, we need to not focus on all the things that we are giving up. We have to think about all the things we're getting back, potentially, if we do it right, if we do the transition right, there's an opportunity to do that.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And I think, someone who I really enjoy reading his pieces is George Monbiot, who writes for The Guardian. He writes, this is his book, actually. He wrote a book called Feral, which, but there's a scene that I always remember where he talks about like walking in like the Welsh kind of valleys, you know, and lived in Wales for so long. I know exactly where he's referring to. And he just talked about like looking over, you know, climbing this hill and looking down over the valley, and saying that most people look over this view and they say, oh, look how beautiful it is, look like the rolling hills into the distance. And he said he always looks down over and says, look at this absolute devastation, because this should all be covered in trees.
Yeah.
And he said there's just a few kind of sparse kind of outcrops of trees. And actually that really made me rethink when I'm driving through country areas and you look around and you think, wow, like it's beautiful, but it also is barren and stripped back and so kind of influenced by agriculture and by people. And I hope that we kind of, you know, get to a point where we get to kind of enjoy the wildness of the world again.
Yeah.
You know?
It's the exact same thing in Scotland.
Yeah.
I've heard people say that when you go hiking in Scotland, it's absolutely stunningly beautiful because it's all these, you know, amazing geological formations and rivers and mountains. But actually, if you stop and listen, there's no bird song. There's nothing like that. You know, there's tons of deer which have run rampant because they're a business. They're people go and pay money to hunt them.
Yes.
And that's what the whole landscape is there for. It's to run this like game business rather than what it was probably hundreds of thousands of years ago, which was just dense native forest and like would have been full of life. And, you know, there'd be open areas as well. And, you know, and with wolves and foxes and badgers and actually wild cats as well, which are native. They're all, you know, all extinct now, you know. So
I know, and I think, where did I come across it? Maybe it was in one of the Guardian articles, but they were talking about how, you know, we reckon that there are species going extinct almost on a daily basis in the Amazon that are undiscovered.
That we never even came in contact with.
If you actually sit and absorb that fact, you know, something that took millions of years of this kind of exquisite process of evolution to just be wiped out. Yeah. You know, no wonder people feel this profound loss and grief for that. You know, that we know of we're the only place in the universe that has this abundance of life. And we're just squandering it and, you know, destroying it. It really is, you know, it's a very realistic thing to feel sad about.
Sorry, guys, probably not helping you to be more optimistic here.
I guess the message is, if that scares you, then, well, you know, think about what you can do rather than kind of dismissing that kind of dissonance and trying to find a way to kind of think your way out of it. We can also try to find a way to do our way out of it, you know, to do things differently. I think that's probably the psychological perspective on it. Yeah,
there's the old kind of slogan, which is a bit cheesy now, which is think global, act local. And that actually has a lot, like we've all heard it loads, like so many times that it sounds a bit like old, cliched. Actually, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that.
Yes.
You know, it's like understand what the global problem is on a big scale and then just find your little way. And, you know, also I'd invite people to think about, rather than just doing the things that are maybe seem attractive to you, think about doing the things that maybe have a big, could be like ripples, you know? And like one thing is, you know, think about how you're going to vote in the next election. Like, is the candidate you're voting for, do they believe in climate change? Do they have a credible plan to take action on it? You know, are they part of a party that, you know, are committed to it? Like, that's probably the single biggest thing. Another thing people don't realize about is you all probably have a workplace pension that you're just automatically enrolled in. Many of those pensions invest your money in fossil fuels and Coca-Cola and, you know, these big companies that are you know, fueling the climate crisis. You can either change your pension to another provider, or many pension providers also have an ethical option or an eco option where they don't, they basically won't, they'll take your money out of fossil fuels and companies that have a poor record in terms of pollution and things like that. So that over time, when you think about how much your pension grows, how much money that is going into investing in things, that could actually be your single biggest thing that you do.
Oh God, yeah.
So I invite people to think about what your big leverage points are